Locke's Quest is a mixed genre strategy title in which the mainstay of the game plays out over two distinct stages. Stage 1 has you build defences like walls, gates, turrets and traps, and Stage 2 sees you take direct control over your character Locke and usually pits a horde of enemies at you for you to defend your new construction against. It's all packaged in a gorgeous pixel art style and presented alongside a fantasy story that is frankly a bit trite. It's important to know that Locke's Quest, or at least the version I've been playing the last week or so, is a remastered port of a game that originally came out on the Nintendo DS. As a result, there are some elements that seem to have been lost in translation, as it were, and the attempts to fit what once played out over two screens with touch controls to PC hardware can be a little bit awkward. You can play with either a gamepad or mouse and keyboard, but curiously you have to pick which on launch, and there's no option to toggle between when playing. Neither control scheme represents the best experience either, with what feels like compromises made to both. Building with the gamepad is fiddly, and you're given a time limit to do so, which can be utterly tedious if you're attempting to make something coherent. The mouse and keyboard make building a lot easier, but make combat and repairing a bit of a mess. Why am I having to wiggle this around? It just doesn't feel responsive at all. The build phase takes a little pinch of tower defense with a mix of different turret effects and trap options, but where traditional titles tend to veer towards enemies with a strict, predictable path, Locke's Quest tends to task you with building a small fort, or more regularly, a wall of guns. Enemies come from all angles and will aggro onto your defences, and you're punished pretty quickly for placing them too forward where you can't repair them. The best strategy is often just to dump as many turrets as you can in one impenetrable huddle so you wipe out any enemies before they have any chance to damage anything. The action phase pits waves of enemies on your position, and after your first few victories, additional objectives get sprinkled in, which go some way to justify the fusion of the genres. Having to micromanage repairing your defences with completing objectives is where the game's challenge feels interesting and enjoyable. Unfortunately, it's simply far too easy to become overwhelmed, and the game's difficulty spiked almost immediately. I was struggling to keep my defences through each wave well into my first hour with the game. It does get slightly easier later on when you have more options for traps and defences, but it is way too hard to get past those initial levels. There's a distinct lack of information being presented at the right time too. The game really needs some sort of glossary so that you can reference how much damage and health enemies and structures have. There's so much potential for depth lost by simply not giving the player any insight into how they could approach their defensive play. On top of that, it didn't take long for little bugs to start crawling out of the woodwork. Sprites would sometimes disappear at the edge of the screen as if they were expecting a different aspect ratio. Sprite overlap frequently malfunctioned, so it's common to see half the art obscured by something that's supposed to be behind it, and the bugs don't just restrict themselves to aesthetic untidiness either. Enemy AI regularly broke, menus wouldn't respond, my towers sometimes stopped firing altogether, and in one particularly memorable moment my character got pushed into a sign while I was fighting and I couldn't get out. I had to wait for the mission timer to run down before I could continue, and then the menus wouldn't let me restart anyway. I've played the game since on launch day, and there doesn't seem to be a hotfix to address any of these issues. Sadly, I think this one needed more time to bake in the oven. Locke's Quest has a fantastic conceit. I love the idea of fusing a tower defense game with an action RPG, but in practice it's a game that offers little depth in either direction. If it wasn't also mired by glitchy port issues and obtuse design choices, it might still have won me over. But as it is, this remaster is neither playable nor worth playing. Perhaps a patch could change that, perhaps not. But if you're really interested in trying Locke's Quest out, I'd point you towards the original DS version. This is the end of the video, so I'm gonna do the usual thing about subscribing and liking and sharing and actually probably all the things that you can do, because where was I going with this?